Wonderful. Thanks so much. And thanks for having me, of course. I'm very excited to be part of this workshop, and also very glad to hear that actually many of the things Jessica just raised resonate with my research agenda as a sociologist of science concerned with issues like inclusiveness and diversity within science. And what I want to do within the next 10 minutes is to shift the spotlight on conferences as sites of science communication. So putting the spotlight a bit more on maybe the internal science communication, whereas Jessica highlighted the possibilities of external science communication. And the main argument I want to get across is that to make science conferences more inclusive and tackle inequalities, I argue more is required than inviting female scholars as speakers, although I'm very glad to be here today. But I think what is required is a critical reflection on practices of peer review and valuation that affect who gets to participate in these conferences. And I'm very glad to share some research underpinning this argument in this workshop, as I think that you, as representatives of associations and organizations which form the ISC community, are actually important agents who can foster and facilitate such reflection in your respective research fields. The starting point of my argument is that conferences are actually more than sites of science communication. They are constituting spaces of scientific fields that are shaped by and shaping their social and epistemic structure by providing important spaces for knowledge exchange and circulation, but also for professional socialization, scholarly positioning, and networking. While researchers may not always go home with tangible outcomes, bibliometric science studies indicate that participation has notable effects. Especially international conference attendance is related with increased publication productivity and enhanced involvement in cross-country collaboration. With that, conferences impact on research trajectories of individuals and of scientific fields as defining social and epistemic moments happen therein. Their significance for careers and for the development of collective research agendas makes it even more concerning that conferences are spaces that are far from being inclusive. Quite the opposite. They reflect and reinforce multiple forms of inequalities that structure today's global academia. So empirical studies from various fields show that representation at conferences is skewed along gender, but also along race and ethnicity, social class and caste, geographical location, and other dimensions. I've put some references here on the slide, but there are many more, and the number of publications documenting imbalances along these lines is constantly growing. And I want to give you one concrete example from research I have carried out with a colleague of mine, Elena Matvichuk. We have analyzed the past 3 World Congresses of the International Union of Forest Research Organizations with regard to actors that participated therein in active roles. So being engaged as members of the Congress Scientific Committee, as session chairs, as presenters, or as invited keynote speakers or panelists. And we found that the number of women and scholars based in southern world regions performing such active roles has been increasing over the past decade. So for instance, the share of female scholars overall rose from 32% in 2010 to 37% in 2019. Their shares increased especially among the groups of presenters and invited keynote speakers, which certainly indicates that the organizers and UFRO as a network organization are already making efforts to diversify the composition of scholars getting a stage at these congresses. However, the overall dominance of male scholars affiliated with Northern institutions remains still striking, and was particularly pronounced among session chairs and scientific committees. So taking all congresses together, the share of women among session chairs, for instance, was only 24%. And almost 80% of all Congress scientific committee members were men. 73% came from only 3 subregions, namely Northern America, Western, and Northern Europe. whereas scholars based in Eastern Europe, Southern Asia, Central America, and the Caribbean, Western and Central Asia, and Northern Africa were not present in any of the 3 Congress committees. Now, why is that a problem? These backstage roles in conferences are assigned with specific agenda setting and gatekeeping power. And science studies have clearly shown that peer review and selection processes in academia are impacted by a kind of a homophily bias, meaning the tendency to prefer similar others. In the context of conferences, empirical studies and analysis have revealed that male session chairs are more likely to select men as speakers in their panels. Moreover, scholars tend to interact with colleagues from their own geographical, cultural, and linguistic regions and bring in their own networks into the conference space. We can confirm this from the field of forest science, where a master student of mine, Leonie Huber, had interviewed forest scholars engaged in one of the congresses mentioned before. And when asked about how they selected the papers for their open panels, many mentioned that they had actually already some colleagues in mind, which they knew before, and actually already included these into their open submission in order to have a high quality panel in the end. And while this seems to be a very reasonable strategy from an individual's perspective, which I have employed myself as well before, it is one of the practices that reproduce and reinforce imbalances in the conference space, because it further marginalizes scholars who are not already part of existing networks and research communities. Now, the question is what to do, how to tackle these inequalities at conference events. And there's already a lot of advice out there, practical advice on what to do. Recently, Savenas Sarabipur and colleagues have published a comment in Nature Human Behavior, including this nice graph, where they put forward what they call a checklist of recommended key considerations for every academic conference. And they make very concrete suggestions, such as offering visa-free attendance or on-site childcare and providing nursery rooms. And while I would fully support all the points they raise, I would argue that more is required. What is also required is to reflect on and reconsider prevailing valuation practices and their impact on social and epistemic diversity in the conference space. So what do I mean by this? Questions that would need to be raised and discussed within research communities include: what are the criteria we consciously or unconsciously employ in setting topics, in selecting abstracts at conferences, and on which grounds do we do this? How do they impact on what kind of research is being communicated and which is left out? How do norms of valuation, like what we consider as relevant for an international congress, or what we consider to indicate quality, like how an abstract is written, privilege or marginalize certain scholars and types of research? My stance is that to make science conferences more inclusive, such questions need to be raised, and I admit they are probably not that easy to answer. However, to make room for such questions, I think it would be essential to, first of all, address some of the backstage inequalities I mentioned earlier on. So making sure that conference scientific committees, for instance, as well as session chairs, and not only the panel of keynote speakers invited, do involve scholars from groups that have previously been underrepresented. Making sure that they have a voice, not only on stage, but also in terms of setting the knowledge agenda and in making programmatic decisions. Diversifying the composition of scholars, having a say in the sort of curating work of conferences would certainly be one step to make them a more inclusive space of science communication. I very much thank you for your attention, and I'm very looking forward to hearing your thoughts. Please feel free to contact me if you would like to continue the discussion after the workshop. And if you get interested, which I hope, in delving deeper into conference research, I have listed all the studies I referred to on this last slide of the presentation, which Senja will upload after the workshop. And I also warmly recommend a blog by colleagues from the UK, which is titled Conference Inference, and which is really a great source of pertinent scholarship on conferences and their structuring effects. So thank you for listening.